The design document is a critical deliverable for any IT project. If your design document is flawed, then the product you are building may ultimately be flawed as well. In this video, I'm going to share some pro tips when creating your design document. So let's get started. First of all, what is a design document? Well, the design document for an IT project is the description of the solution to the problem of your project. It's based off all your requirements. So you have a set of requirements that have been gathered at the start of the project, and those requirements will describe the customer need. They describe exactly what the customer wants out of the thing that you're going to build. And once you have those requirements, you assess them, and then you design something that you're going to build. You design the product. That's what your design document is. And it's a thorough description of the solution, the end solution. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a blueprint. A blueprint is more like a configuration document that describes the configuration and code exactly. But the design document will be very thorough, be very detailed, lots of diagrams, and it should describe exactly how your solution is going to work. It should describe how the functionality is going to work. And it's really important that you get it right because, as I say, you're going to base your build off of this document. You're going to code your application, or whatever IT change you're doing is going to be based off this design document. So if the design document is not correct, then ultimately your build may be incorrect as well. And that's going to lead to unhappy customers, rework, extra money, extra time on your project, which we do not want. Okay, so with that being said, let's now move on to my pro tips. So I'm going to share 4 pro tips with you when creating your design document. The first pro tip is you want to ensure traceability. You want to ensure traceability. So what do I mean by traceability? Traceability is ensuring that you can trace your product, your ultimate build, every aspect of your build back to a single requirement. And the requirements document, as I said earlier, is done at the start of the project. So what you want to do is go through all your requirements and make sure that you've got that aspect of the requirement covered in the design document. And once your design document is written, you want to make sure you can trace every element of that design document. Every section of it needs to trace back to a initial requirement. Otherwise, why have you built it? It needs to somehow complement or enhance or translate into a requirement. So that's tip number 1, because once you've done that and you can trace all your requirements, your design back to all your requirements. When you come to your testing phase, you can make sure you are designing every element of you're testing every element of your design. And again, you can trace that back to a requirement. What you want to do with any IT project to ensure that it's been thoroughly tested is to make sure that every requirement has been tested. But it's difficult to trace a test right back to the requirement without that intermediary stage, which is the design. So if you can make sure that every section of the design is mapped back to a requirement, then you can make sure every test that you're doing is going back to a part of the design. You can trace it all the way back to the requirements. So that's what we mean by traceability. And that's very important for governance, and it's very important for a control to ensure that nothing has been missed, that none of your customer requirements have been missed, and everything has been built. And you can prove that by testing every element of the design, and therefore every requirement has been tested as well. So that is pro tip number 1, ensure traceability back to the requirements. Now, pro tip number 2 is to ensure that you have all the right stakeholders involved in the process of creating that design document. So typically it's going to be engineering or an IT function that will create this design document because it's going to be an IT solution. But there will be some business people involved, and those business people may have some technical understanding. There usually is some kind of function in the business where you've got almost like a hybrid IT and business role, and they may be running or looking after the application or the software that you're building or changing in the day-to-day world. So they may understand it very well. They may understand how all the functionality works, and they may even understand some of the underlying code as well. But you want to make sure people like that are also involved in the reviewing of the design document as it's being created. What you want to do is create that document in an iterative manner. So you write a little bit, make sure all your stakeholders have had a chance to review it and get their 2 cents in and make sure it all looks right, and make sure they're doing almost like mini impact assessments to everything they understand about the surrounding IT landscape and their business area. So it's being built up, and all those right people and all those perspectives are getting poured into that design document, and that's happening all the way along. You don't want someone to go off in a dark room, or not a dark room, in a closed room, and write the entire document and spit it out at the end, because you would have missed a lot of chances, and there'll be a lot of rework. Well, I say you would have missed a lot of chances to make the document or the design better, and ensure that all those impacts have been identified and addressed as they are identified, and it's not all done at the last minute and you have to go back and start again. So it's really important you get all those stakeholders involved, and really do spend some time with your team thinking about who needs to be involved in this design document. Because one of the things that always happens on projects is during the testing phases, when people start testing the product, complaints start to be made that this hasn't been built right, or why wasn't this built, or why was it built in this way. And all those people that are making that noise, if they're making noise, they either shouldn't be making the noise, or if they are within their right to make that noise, then they should have been involved in the design phase. They should have been part of that process. So you really need to try and think ahead about who's going to be using the application, who does the application impact, who are those key stakeholders that need to have a say in that design document and how it's being built up and how it's going to look. Because if you can get them involved as you're doing it, and they have a chance to review it at all the different stages of that process, and they finally are involved in the sign off of that document, the approval of that document, before you start building the application based off that design, it's going to save you so much trouble down the line. So that's probably the most number one important tip, because if you can get that right and get all the stakeholders involved in that design process, then that pretty much covers everything. It's high leverage. It's going to make sure that your design document is right, and ultimately your build is going to be good as well. So really make sure you do that. So that's design tip number 2. Make sure all key stakeholders are involved in creating that document. Now, design tip number 3 is to ensure that all data transfers have a thorough description of how they're going to work. So when you build any kind of IT product or IT software, you're going to have data flowing through that software. It can't just have no data in it, otherwise it's pointless. It's going to store data, it's going to move data around, and depending on how big your solution is, how complex it is, you might have various applications, you might have one application that has several parts in it. Either way, you're going to have data moving across the landscape that you're building. And what I often see is there's a lack of detail regarding how that data is going to move through that landscape or move through the system. You might see a diagram in the design document that's got arrows pointing that represents data, saying, okay, the data is going to be moved from here, from here, from here. But you need to clarify exactly how that data is going to be transferred. What is the mechanism for transferring that data? What is the IT solution? How exactly is that going to work? I've seen it several times when you're getting to the build phase of the solution, or halfway through the build phase, when it comes to starting to move the data about, that it wasn't actually specified exactly how that's going to work. And that can cause extra money, it can cause problems, it can cause issues that impact the whole design, and you might have to adjust things, and it's a lot of work and a lot of headache that can easily be avoided if you just establish right from the start how is that data going to move through the landscape. So make sure you get that captured correctly. Okay, that's tip number 3. Make sure you describe how data is going to move through your IT solution. Okay, pro tip number 4, the final one, is, what is my pro tip number 4? Yeah, ensure that you have your control sufficiently documented in the design document. Things like user access management, or just things like, how are you going to ensure that the data is not changing when it's moving through the landscape? So things like preventative controls, things like corrective controls. So you want to make sure that as that data is moving through your landscape, that it doesn't change, it doesn't become corrupted, that it's in the right format. So you've got to have various control points across your system landscape in your design. So you really need to make sure that you're clarifying what those controls are. How are you going to ensure that everything is working as it should do? How do you know that it's working correctly? How do you know that the calculations that your software is doing are correct? How do you know that the functionality is working correctly? You can't just guess and assume it's going to be working correctly just because the IT guys have designed it that way. You've got to prove it, and you've got to make sure there's controls in place to ensure that all that data moving through the system is correct, that all the calculations that are being done are correct, and that everything is moving in the right way. So that's where your controls come in. So you need to make sure you've got adequate controls in your design, maybe an entire section just on the controls that are going to give your stakeholders comfort that the application works as it should do, and you can trust it. You can trust that it's working correctly. And if it's spitting out numbers, those numbers are going to be correct at the end of the day. Okay, those are my pro tips for creating your design document. So I'll do a quick recap and then we'll call it a day. So number one is make sure you have traceability back to the requirement. So every section of your design should trace back to the original requirement, and then you can trace your requirements to your design and your design to your test scripts when you come to test the product. That way you can ensure that nothing has been missed when you're testing your product and all requirements have been built correctly. That was tip number one. Tip number two is make sure that all stakeholders or applicable relevant stakeholders are involved in creating that design document, and they have a chance to review it and get their say as it's being created. Tip number three is to make sure you have a detailed description of how data is going to move through your IT solution, to make sure that is captured and it's very clear how that's going to work. And then pro tip number four is make sure you have adequate controls in your design document, that you are going to build it in a way that ensures that the data will be correct and it's robust and nothing is going wrong within the actual system, that any numbers that are being generated or any data that's being captured or being spat out can be trusted. Okay, that's the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up, and until tomorrow, please take care.